Hello and welcome. My name is James Lamond. I'm the director of the Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, in Washington, D.C. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this event on the rule of law in Central and Eastern Europe. I would like to thank the Embassy in Slovakia for partnering with us on this important event. Over the last decade, there have been significant challenges to the rule of law in Central and Eastern Europe. Under the veneer of a democratic mandate, many politicians have sought to consolidate power using an array of tactics, including drafting new constitutions, packing and politicizing courts, eroding media freedoms and tightening restrictions on independent press, bolstering executive power and restricting civil society. In recent months, tensions between some of the worst violators and the European Union have escalated amid the need for COVID-19 recovery funds, threats to women's and LGBTQ rights, and the questions of the supremacy of European law above national laws and debates about judicial independence. Just recently, the European Commission wrote a letter to the governments of Hungary and Poland saying the problems with independence of judiciary and rule of law issues pose a risk to the EU financial interests. This has been seen as a potential informal precursor to further action. Meanwhile, outside the EU, in countries like Belarus, we continue to see harsh political environments. But there's also a more complicated picture than is often portrayed. There are signs of hope in many countries across the region as pro-democracy governments have been elected and opposition parties gain more sophisticated political strategies. So what is the current state of the rule of law in Central and Eastern Europe? How should the US and EU policymakers think about these challenges to democratic governance and human rights? And as leaders around the world gather for the Summit for Democracy, this is a particularly important moment to think about these issues and the opportunity for meaningful action. Here to help us answer some of these questions and think through these important issues, I'm honored to be joined by our four esteemed experts to talk with us today. We have with us Peter Csaky, who is a senior fellow with CEPA and the director of the Political Capital Institute in Budapest. We have Maria Zselyke, who is a senior fellow at CEPA as well, and a media analyst and journalist specializing in Central and Eastern European affairs. Dalibor Rohak is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a research associate at the Wilfrid Martin Center for European Studies, and a fellow at the Anglo-American University in Prague. And finally, we have Csaky, who is a research director for Europe and Eurasia at Freedom House, where she also works on the Nations in Transit project. Maria, Peter, Dalibor, Csaky, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to start off with some brief opening remarks from each of the panelists and then move into a conversation. So Csaky, would you please kick us off?
Thank you, James. And so since today's discussion will focus on the current state of the rule of law in Central and Eastern Europe, let me use this time to give a brief overview of where we are with regards to judicial and media independence in two countries, in Poland and Hungary. Because really these are the two countries where we see an autocratization happening. It's not just democratic backsliding. And so there are important differences between Poland and Hungary, and I'm sure we will go into detail on those differences. But in both cases, we can talk about a significant institutional capture. Nations in Transit, which is our annual report on democracy in Europe and Eurasia that you mentioned, James, looks at 7 indicators that represent institutions in a broad sense. So it looks at elected institutions, such as national and local governments, as well as non-elected institutions like the media, civil society, or the judiciary. And Hungary has seen the largest decline ever tracked in nations in transit among all the 29 countries that we measure. And this report has been around since 1995, while Poland has seen the largest decline ever tracked on the judicial independence indicator in nations in transit. And so this shows that the democratic erosion in Hungary has impacted all institutions in a broad sense, while in Poland, much of the deterioration focused on the judiciary. And there is an additional difference between Poland and Hungary, and that is that in Hungary, much of the institutional capture happened lawfully, in line with the letter, even if not the spirit of the law. While in Poland, this happened in an unlawful way, violating the country's own constitution, as well as international norms. And so there are these two different methods for capturing the judiciary, what one can call rule by law, and the second is, for lack of a better word, what I call reg the law. And so as a result, in Hungary, the independence of the judiciary is seriously compromised. Lower level courts still function largely independently, although there are reports that that judges increasingly avoid confrontation to be able to keep their posts. But the higher level courts most of the time rule in line with government expectations. In Poland, on the other hand, what we see today is a dual legal system, where many judges resist government pressure and continue to apply EU law and Polish law, but where the executive has come in and has started changing the rules of the game. And it's clear that those changes have violated international norms, as I mentioned, because it has been declared in the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights, the rulings of the European Court of Justice, as well as the Polish Constitutional Tribunal before it was captured by the current government. And so let me add the point here about illiberal learning, because we are seeing that happen in the judiciary. Some steps taken by the Law and Justice government were copied over from Fidesz, such as sending judges into early retirement. And we have seen that in the media as well. So Poland's media environment remains much more vibrant than that of Hungary, but the Law and Justice Party has, similar to Hungary, turned the public broadcaster into a propaganda mouthpiece. It has used state-owned companies to acquire as much as 4/5 of the regional media outlets in the country. And it has put economic and legislative pressure on Discovery, which is the owner of a government critical channel. And so these are, in fact, a number of tools that are available to authoritarian-minded leaders to capture the judiciary and the media. It's not an exhaustive list, but these tools include such mechanisms as I said, sending judges into early retirement, expanding the bench, changing the appointment procedures, or just overhauling the court system in and of itself. And in the media, these tools can range from legal and economic steps, such as regulatory pressures, government-backed acquisitions, or SLAPs, the strategic lawsuits against public participation. And in some rare cases, even extralegal tools, such as harassment of journalists. And what is new in the case of Poland and Hungary is the fact that these countries continue to insist that they are democracies and that they change the laws in line with the will of the majority. So underlying all of this, the very concept of the rule of law is being challenged. The idea that we have clear rules that apply equally to everyone, including the government itself, rather than arbitrary and opaque rules that work differently for different people and different groups. Earlier, some might remember that Poland and Hungary even flouted the idea of a so-called rule of law institute, which would clearly help them reinterpret what is meant by the rule of law. And so lastly, let me just say a few words about the difficulty of undoing the damage and restoring judicial and media independence in these cases, because this is a question that has come up and is coming up in Poland and Hungary right now. And in Poland's case, perhaps the fixes are somewhat easier because there are international court judgments that have already established that the government has broken the law, as well as international norms. So they can serve as a basis for any future steps. In the case of Hungary, where the opposition is pulling neck and neck with the governing parties right now, ahead of elections next year, this is a much less clear-cut issue. So basically, if the opposition doesn't win a supermajority, it has a very little chance of undoing the damage lawfully in the immediate term. But I'm happy to go into more detail and discuss this later, because I think that this is a very interesting and important conversation that needs to happen right now. So just to summarize, these developments show that it takes time to dismantle a democracy, but that once you have started on that route, it's a long way to come back as well. And so it might take just as much time to rebuild it too. So let me stop here.
Wonderful. That was a fantastic overview, and I do want to come back to the point you raised about the opposition needing a supermajority. So hopefully we can return to that later in the conversation. But Peter, can we turn to you next?
Yes, thank you very much for having me in the discussion. And I would follow up on some points that Csaky have already raised. I think this authoritarian learning process is crucially important, and we can see it not only in the institutional transformations, but also, for example, in the topics via which authoritarian leaders inspire each other in the broader region. And what we can see right now, for example, is this emergence of an anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans rhetoric in Hungary is more or less the copy-paste of Andrzej Duda's successful re-election campaign, where he was running under the umbrella of this topic, and he could win the presidential seat or secure his presidential seat. But I do think also that in the region, in the Visegrad region, at least, we see more and more some kind of disruption. The V4 is increasingly becoming V2 plus V2 in the sense that the illiberal institutional transformation that we can observe in Hungary and in Poland are not so similar to the tendencies that we can observe in Czech Republic and Slovakia, and especially after the latest Czech elections, Orbán's dreams of this coherent illiberal Visegrad bloc seems to evaporate, and the term Visegrad is not so popular in any other capitals than Budapest. And even if we take a look at the foreign policy, for example, we can see that Hungary is a clear outlier because the pro-Russian, pro-Chinese political shift or geopolitical shift that we could observe recently in Hungary is also not something that is replicated in any other countries. Even, for example, in Slovakia, a country with much stronger, let's say, pan-Slavic and pro-Russian traditions, the political elites seem to be more immune to the geopolitical influences. And I would put this whole rule of law issue into this geopolitical context, raising 2 points. One is that what Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes brilliantly summarized in their book, The Light Hath Failed. There is an emerging narrative in whole Central Eastern Europe and among post-communist countries that this is not the West that should be imitated anymore. It's not the United States that serves as a model. It's not the European Union, Germany, France, and so on that serves as models. We Central Eastern European countries should serve as a model. And the West should imitate us because we are just doing better economically, in terms of stopping migration, in terms of strengthening conservative values, and so on. So there is this powerful ideology and this identity game behind all that is most vocal, I think, in Hungary and a bit in Poland, but all populists in overall region use this narrative. And of course, imitation is not a very pleasant situation. So it's something that feels empowering for many of the voters. And the other element is that there's an increasing perception of that the West is on the decline. And the strength of the West is on the decline, of the United States, of the European Union as well. And if we put into this context what's happening in Hungary, for example, Orbán told it many times that the winds are blowing from the east. So if you are betting for the collapse of the West, of course, it seems rational to turn more towards the east. And that's what, to a small extent, I think, or partially explains the gravity that we could observe in Hungary towards Russia and China in the last few years. And Viktor Orbán have mentioned several times that the Western countries are simply unable to cope with the challenges of our times. But of course, there is a very important other element here, which is which is something that I think the Biden administration quite clearly see here, which is the geopolitical corruption. If there are many businesses with Russia and China, we can see it in the whole region, but I think again, Hungary is an outlier in the pace and amount of these new businesses. The extension of the nuclear power plant in Paks, some cooperation in the transport sector with Russia, extending cooperation with Huawei, Budapest-Belgrade railway line, and the list goes on. And these projects all benefit a small circle around the prime minister, and it also partially justifies this appeal of the East. But I would say that for me, this is something that is the most dramatic transformation beside the institutional aspects that Zselyke have pointed to, that the Hungarian government in party, for example, that was very vocally and loudly pro-Western before they came back to power in 2010, right now are only talking about the West in pejorative terms. And while in most of the European countries, the leaders are mostly afraid of Russian and Chinese influence into their elections. In Hungary, there is a fear of American influence into the election. This has been just articulated by Foreign Minister Szijjártó. And when she was asked at CNN that why does he talk about these things, he told that we in Hungary have experienced many times that there are influences coming from the East and influences from the West as well. And he did not elaborate that Hungary at the same time is part of the Western alliances of EU and NATO. But this kind of identity game, I think in Hungary especially, have turned into a very emotional and revanchist attitude towards West and the Western institutions, and it results in increasing appetite for obstruction, as Chris Walker have written in one of his pieces, and an increasing appetite for veto, which can slow down and in some cases hamper the operation of the Western alliances.
Thank you for that. There's a lot there. And I think that you touched on a lot of important issues, including this sort of transnational ideological sort of movement that you mentioned, but also the implications on foreign policy, which is something I think is an important factor, which we can cover a bit more. And I really like the V2 plus V2. And I know Dalbor is going to talk a bit more about the different countries across the region. But thank you, Peter. Dalbor, love to hear what you have to say.
James, thank you so very much for for including me on this panel. I, like many on this panel, obviously have followed the developments across Visegrad countries with a degree of concern. I remember I wrote my first alarmist op-ed about the state of Hungarian democracy for the Weekly Standard magazine, now out of business, back in 2012. And interestingly, it has, as of late, placed me in a minority on the center right in America. You see, all these thought leaders of the conservative movement flocking to Budapest and talking about Viktor Orban with a degree of admiration rather than concern. I think that's profoundly misguided. Not because there wouldn't be any policy particulars on which you couldn't agree with Viktor Orban, but rather because the Hungarian government, as well as the government in Warsaw, have pushed their countries on very distinctly authoritarian trajectories. And Csaky and Peter obviously know a lot more about this than myself, starting from the purely partisan rewriting of the constitution in Hungary in 2011, the overhaul of the electoral system, the gerrymandering, the packing and politicization of courts in both countries, the de facto end of some sort of constitutional review of legislation in Poland, the erosion of media freedom, not just through takeovers of public broadcasting, but also through all sorts of arbitrary, non-transparent licensing policies. It was recently a US-owned news channel that found itself in crosshairs of these efforts in Poland. 2011, I believe, 500 media outlets in Hungary were donated to a centralized foundation by the previous owners. That foundation is exempt from antitrust law. So there are all these efforts, within some sort of, strictly speaking, legal framework that really are tilting the playing field, both for media outlets, for NGOs, for opposition parties, in a way that makes it very difficult for them to compete with the incumbents. We've seen the attacks on civil society, the Hungarian law criminalizing groups providing assistance to asylum seekers. And this has been accompanied, particularly in the Hungarian case, by a measurable, visible rise in kleptocracy and corruption, certainly helped by the centralized process of distribution of EU funds in the country, going through the Prime Minister's office. And it has also, and I think this is important for the American audience, been accompanied by a forging of deeper geopolitical ties with revisionist powers in the case of Hungary. Viktor Orbán called Hungary a pillar of the Belt and Road Initiative. Hungarian government has been very consistent in blocking any effort by the European Union, in particular, to hold China accountable on Hong Kong, on the Uyghur minority. Orbán called these efforts as being politically inconsequential and frivolous. And I would hope that the sort of conservative and Republican-minded members of our audience will remember the Hungarian rebuke to the Trump administration over its own 5G initiative in 2020. Obviously, like my colleagues on this panel, I have frequent conversations, particularly with American policymakers and people in the foreign policy community, about what should be done in response. These conversations are typically prefaced by sort of acknowledgement that both the European Union and NATO are principally communities of values, and that the response needs to be based on these values. But it is not easy, I have to say, because democratic values and rule of law and the exact meaning are hotly contested topics at the present time in the West as well. So it's not like these countries are complete outliers and are sort of in a we should not look at them through sort of Orientalist lenses and see them as sort of being faced with problems that are fundamentally different from the ones facing democratic societies in the West. But my suggestions for what should be done, I suppose, could be organized around four basic insights. First of all, I do believe that in order to be constructive, a Western, American, European response to the sort of practices we are seeing in Hungary and Poland, which can be labeled as de-democratization or democratic backsliding, really ought to be organized around a sort of understanding of democracy and around priorities that are shared across partisan and ideological lines, in order to get the widest possible coalition in defense of democracy and rule of law in these countries. We've seen with efforts like the Sargentini report in the European Parliament, instead, an effort that has been far more sort of ambitious and encompassing in sort of enumerating the transgressions of, say the Hungarian government against norms that are generally accepted in the West. And I do believe that really conflating issues like LGBTQI rights, reproductive rights, questions of immigration, or indeed problems that are endemic to the region, like the treatments of Roma minority, which obviously Romania and Slovakia could sort of be sort of held accountable for on their own terms. Just conflating all these things together with really the very idiosyncratic erosion of rule of law and de-democratization, which has been occurring in Poland and Hungary, is more often than not unhelpful, and it actually unwittingly helps aspiring autocrats in places like Poland and Hungary by being able to change the conversation and suddenly not have a conversation about media freedom or independence of the judiciary, but about sort of the excesses of the Western or European left. My second point is that, which is related, is that the interplay between rule of law and political issues is very often very complicated, and there is a sort of vast gray area in which political problems are also legal problems. Obviously, European Code of Justice has, asserted back in the 60s the sort of direct de facto supremacy of EU law over national law, but that has been a hotly contested issue in countries beyond Central Europe. So these conflicts that we are seeing currently between apex courts in Poland and Hungary and the European Code of Justice are not completely without precedent, right? Like we've seen disagreements between the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany and the European Code of Justice. Obviously, those are different kinds of disagreements because we can argue that these are disagreements that happen in good faith and in the past have been sort of solved by mutual accommodation and some sort of compromising rather than by one party railroading the other. And my contention is, however problematic these recent Hungarian and Polish decisions, particularly Polish decisions, have been with regard to European law, I do believe that both these countries and the EU have to somehow relearn the art of sort of mutual accommodation, or the whole edifice will collapse. I mean, the EU is not the United States, where ultimately the sort of supremacy of the federal law has been asserted, through things like the Civil War. And so in the past, actually, I've been myself very critical of Angela Merkel's approach towards some of these questions that have to do with de-democratization in say Hungary. But she is not wrong in saying that there are not necessarily sort of straightforward legal fixes to political problems and political conflicts. My third point is that not all of these countries are the same, which is kind of obvious. But the corollary of that is that we need carrots as much as we need sticks. And I think there is a time and place to celebrate the success stories of the region, to give them greater voice, amplify them, give countries that are behaving responsibly, that are really the epitome of good governance. I'm thinking of Estonia, that also are very responsible geopolitical actors. They need more access in Washington. Right now, really the sort of realignment towards China that's happening across Central and Eastern Europe, I think is making Central Europe and Eastern Europe, Baltic states, an extremely attractive region for US foreign policy, as it itself sort of refocusing its priorities towards the Indo-Pacific. I think there could be a separate conversation about whether NATO should have a Secretary General from the region as well. But I leave that aside. Final point, I do believe that timing matters in all of this. So when people ask me what should be done now, I'm not entirely sure I'm in favor of a sort of rah-rah Big Bang approach. I mean, these two countries, Hungary and Poland, are heading for elections, which might end up being very sort of close and contested. Those elections can either reverse some of the existing trends, they can amplify them further. And I think external actors, including the United States, including the European Union institutions, ought to tread very carefully, which is not to detract and from the basic premise that the response from Brussels and Washington ought to be values-based, ought to be principled, but it also has to be constructive. And there are obviously at times there's a necessity for difficult conversations between friends and allies, but there are better and worse ways to have difficult conversations. And on that note, I'll stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. There was a lot there to unpack, and we have a lot to cover. So I want to move on to Maria. Dalibor, that was fantastic. But I know Maria also is looking at things a bit more forward-looking as well. So I want to turn to her to open up. Maria, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, James. And I so much appreciated Dalibor's phrase about timing matters. I think timing indeed matters. And when it comes to media freedom situation in Europe, even comparing to the justice system assessments, we're chronically late. European Union has been considering the media freedom or in media sphere in general as something rather devoluted to the national governments, and has been very cautious every time to introduce any scheme, funding scheme or a legislative scheme, except for maybe audiovisual market competition rules that would at any possible way influence the national government's policies in the media sphere. So the problems we're seeing in Hungary, as it was mentioned already by the previous speakers, for example, in the media sphere, exist for at least 10 years. And the problems we're seeing in Poland, which was mentioned, of course, some of them came recently when Law and Justice came to power in 2015. But in the reality, certain things such as overly politicized system of appointment of broadcasting councils have existed in Poland and in some other countries, including Czech Republic, for decades now. The problem was when the European Commission kind of liked the liberal pro-European governments, let's say led by Donald Tusk, it kind of closed the eyes on the fact that it was civic platform that would decide now who would be the members of the council on the TV and radio. And when Law and Justice would come and would indeed start using the public TV and radio much more radically in a propagandist way, it would start cautiously criticizing. But the lack of reform of the system of appointment of TV and radio councils has been there for decades in many countries across the region. And basically public media in these countries have always been dependent hostages, basically, of the political will of the ruling coalitions. So certain things that are now happening in countries of Central Eastern Europe, but also beyond, in some, let's say, Western European countries in the regions as well, have deep roots in the fact that for a long time, media scene has been considered as something that the European Union as an actor should not intervene in. The other thing that has been happening for quite a long time, and not only in Central and Eastern Europe, someone mentioned today that some activists have been punished in Hungary for helping asylum seekers. Well, the strategic litigation lawsuits against public participations of that type are very common in France, in Italy, and other countries where media or NGOs are trying to prevent certain things in the field of migration happening, breaking the human rights. And the issue is, again, the European Union, when it comes to migration challenge, even current migration challenge on the border of Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania with Belarus, tends to turn a blind eye on certain practices. Let me bring just one example. In Latvia and in Poland, there has been a ban for several months for journalists to actually provide any real-time reporting from the border with Belarus. In Poland, this ban will be ended this Friday after 3 months. How many statements did the European Commission make to ask the Polish authorities to restore the access of independent media to the area, or any media to the area? 0. Because, of course, obviously, the migrant crisis right now is being regarded as a part of the geopolitical game where Russia is to blame and Belarus government is being the main malefactor. The problem is, however, that especially such spheres where there is no exact reason for the European Commission yet to accuse the governments, let's say, of its member states in tragic rule of law violations, let's say treatment of migrants, are becoming ticket bomb for the future crisis of rule of law and human rights in these countries. We can look at Croatia, for example. Croatia is one of the leaders in the illegal pushbacks in the European Union. Some statistic data says that Croatia is responsible for 20,000 illegal pushbacks per year out of 40,000 that are done towards migrants. Poland, on that backdrop, is very on that background is a very modest, let's say, executor of that. And the problem with tolerating that has led to the fact that a group of Croatian editors have composed a letter saying that the media are too polarized in migrant crisis, that basically media are now in the country supporting the politicians that vilify migrants, that provide fake news about migrants, and so on and so forth. And this can be most probably the fate and destiny of Poland, of Baltic states, if they will continue to use the, let's say, blind eye of the European Union in order to prevent media from free access to the border, in order to prevent media from telling the story of these irregular migrants, from giving their voice in the society. It would be very profitable for certain governments there. Of course, we know that in Poland, for example, the government is very worried to lose the far-right electorate, the electorate which is already now very vaccine skeptic and is considering stopping supporting the law and justice because of their cautious pro-vaccine policy in COVID. This same electorate seems to be also quite xenophobic. So if the government in countries like Poland, but not necessarily only there, will continue to try to keep the votes of these people, it will of course continue trying to polarize the society, trying to find the common enemy, trying to find the next group of populations of other countries, other citizens. It can be European Union on day one, or Brussels, and then migrants on day two, or Brussels allowing migrants to come in order to keep themselves at power. The consequences of that for the societies can be really damaging. The democracies we're talking about are still quite fragile, young democracies, which are still lacking a lot of experience and time in, for example, building proper critical thinking in the school education, building proper resilience to different information manipulation techniques. So we don't even need Russia and China here. Very anti-Kremlin governments are actually repeating the same arguments that the Kremlin propagandists do when it's needed for them. And the result is confused societies which are growing increasingly frightened, xenophobic, and willing to support far-right politics or populism. From that point of view, we need to look at Hungary, Poland, in some cases Slovenia or Bulgaria when it comes to media freedom as predictors for a much broader crisis of democracy within the European Union, which can very quickly spread beyond the so-called new member states. And the Commission, but also transatlantic powers and partners should actually find a quicker instruments to influence the situation. Now, I will not argue with Dalibor here. Most probably just blaming and shaming will not work. I live in Poland and I know how tired people are of Poland and Hungary always being mentioned as these bad boys of the European Union, when you have in Slovenia the state news agency being defunded for 1.5 years until recently by the state, despite the pressure of Supreme Court and the EU. However, we may come to the situation where this will become a systemic issue, which we cannot solve by just bringing the Article 7 once again. And this is where the current American administration, I believe, can play a much more active role by sometimes taking this role of a counselor, of an advisor, of an initiator of certain acts where the European Commission may feel that its hands are still bound.
I think it's a great point about the role of the U.S. to be a sort of counselor and advisor on these situations. I also wrote down the line about media freedom being in certain states being a predictor for the broader region. I do want to pick up on one point that Dalibor raised that I think is really critical, and I'd love to get Csaky and Peter's thoughts on this as well. Where he raised the issue of bringing certain sort of what we call here in the U.S. kind of cultural hot button issues, such as LGBTQ rights, immigration issues, and reproductive rights, and putting that as part of the conversation on rule of law and media freedoms and independent judiciary. And I really want to get Peter and Csaky's response to that, because I think I think it's a very important point in understanding how we approach these issues and how we talk about them more broadly. Because one of the things we've been seeing is that opposition groups uniting under a single coalition, but these are often ideologically mixed coalitions, and it's important to keep them together for the sake of sort of maintaining the rule of law and democracy and sort of those core democratic issues. But Peter, Csaky, I just want to give you guys a chance to respond to that as well.
Sure. So on what Dalibor was raising, the difference, or that we should not conflate, let's say, cultural issues with de-democratization. And actually, I read your article about this, Dalibor, earlier. It was a very good article. But I have to say I disagree, because I think there is never a clear-cut delineation that works in these issues. And And ultimately, this is about individual rights. So let's take the example of the anti-LGBT law in Hungary. That is a law that very clearly violates norms and violates anti-discrimination rules. So the law basically says that that under 18s cannot see content that quote unquote promotes LGBT plus relationships, whatever that means, or that depicts such relationships. Now, this is an example of a law that is very clearly discriminatory and that very clearly goes against norms. And at the same time, that very clearly touches on individual rights. And so I think in this instance, for example, the EU has a responsibility to act because it needs to protect all of its citizens, irrespective of which country they live in. And so I am generally just reluctant to say that there's a difference between cultural issues and other more important issues, or maybe you're not saying that they are more important, but maybe they are more clear-cut. But there are very clear-cut cases in so-called cultural issues as well. Otherwise, I think just to react to what you were saying about the importance of mutual accommodation, I very much agree with that. And I also agree that there are no straightforward legal fixes in all cases. I agree that in many of these instances, there is a political situation or there is a political solution that is needed. And because the parties are unwilling to admit that there is a political solution that is needed, that is why not much is happening, because they are reluctant. But there are areas and there are cases where the legal solution is clear-cut. And I would say that that the EU law versus national laws discussion that has been happening with Poland is another example of that. Because the way I see that, in that case, the question was not really whether Poland has been attacking the supremacy of the EU law, but whether Poland has or the Polish government has violated its own constitution, broke its own laws, and after that said that EU law does not apply to us. And I think that's just a very different case, because if that happens and if other countries start saying that, okay, we can break our own laws, but the EU law does not apply to us, that will impact the functioning of the European Union. So that's why I generally think that the Polish case is an existential crisis for the European Union, because it impacts legal certainty inside the EU. And it has actually very real consequences, real life consequences, because if companies cannot trust that they will get a fair hearing, that will have an impact on business relations and so on and so forth. We are already seeing many of these consequences. So all of that is to say that there are clear-cut legal cases and less clear-cut cases where we should say that these are political decisions, and that's fine.
So, Peter, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else, and then also I just want to give Dalibor a chance to weigh in again. But Peter, if you have anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, it is, I think, a crucial question, and I tend to agree with Zselyke that yes, the issue of the LGBTQ laws in Hungary have just reveals that how difficult it is to tell apart the symbolic issues from the legal issues. And I do think that until a while it was true that in some reactions of, let's say, European leaders or even US diplomats at the for example, in the time of the Obama administration, have been probably too much focused on issues that are not necessarily distinctive to Hungary, such as anti-Roma, anti-Semitism, which is a problem in Hungary, but it's a problem everywhere. And also, let's say, the rhetoric about LGBTQ people in a period where they were not targets of let's say, legal discriminative action, but this line have been passed, and I think that it is very important to focus on, let's say, on hard issues, legal issues, and geopolitical issues. And that's why I think that the more discussion on how Russian and Chinese influence exacerbates democratic decline, and also how it comes together with this institutional deterioration of democracy. But I do think that both is important, and by the end of the day, it's one package. One thing. The other thing is that the government builds up, a boogeyman of the West anyway. So if the West criticizes something, then of course it fuels the fire. But if European politicians or US diplomats does not tell anything in a totally post-truth environment, the government can fabricate something and react as if the West criticized that. So I think by the end of the day, the most important thing is that the response should be principled and should be consistent, because I think too much tactical approach can finally lead to, I think, inconsequential behavior. And I do think that we have seen it both in the response of the US and both in the response of the EU.
Thank you, Peter. So Dalibor, I want to turn to you next, and I was to give you a chance to weigh in, because I think this is really a profound question that is important, but also something I wanted to get your thoughts on in addition is something I know you've written about a bit, which is the sort of foreign policy implications of this, where you see sort of either like weakened or watered down responses to EU's China policy or EU's Russia policy as a result of sort of more friendlier governments having an influence in the foreign policy decision making. So if you could also touch on that, and then I want to circle around to everyone, get a lightning round on the Summit for Democracy, which is of course in the background of all of this. So Dalibor, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you. No, these are really interesting questions that I can't really say that I have like firmly settled opinions on. But two things strike me as true. The first one is that the EU, that is a mistake to imagine the EU as being a sort of federal entity existing somehow independently from the sort of community of member states that form it. And as such, I'm skeptical of the notion that again, there are straightforward legal or technical fixes to what are essentially problems that involve political disagreements between governments, and particularly when there is a mismatch between what is being sort of claimed as authority by European institutions and the actual sort of toolbox which is at their disposal. You end up in situations in which there is an increasing sort of hollowing out of the entire European edifice, and so I suppose that's what's sort of bothering me about all this. Like, in a situation in which the Polish and Hungarian cases set precedents for the future, and in which you'll have more and more good bad faith actors following them. Well, in that case, there really is no future for the EU, and like no European court, no European commissioner can change that, because fundamentally, when rubber meets the road, the decision making and the sort of bargains that are being made are intergovernmental bargains, and I don't think that's going to change. Right? Like, you would need something akin to a US civil war to sort of settle these constitutional questions in a way that would really empower the European institutions to do what some of my more progressive friends would like them to do. Secondly, I'm not trying to devalue these questions of social tolerance or these hot button cultural issues as unimportant. I think these are very important debates to have. I'm certainly not against efforts within individual countries to sort of move the needle on these questions. We've seen an extraordinary change in sort of social mores and even formal norms surrounding social tolerance, LGBTQI rights over the past 2-3 decades in the West. I believe Central and Eastern Europe is undergoing its own version of those debates right now. My question is whether platforms like the EU and the Transatlantic Alliance are the best tools to advance those agendas, or whether something like subsidiarity applies, in which these questions are best resolved within these societies on their own terms, rather than by inserting European institutions or the transatlantic partnership into those debates. And I will just note that the track record over the past 10 years of inserting European institutions at the forefront of these debates has not been overwhelmingly compelling. And then you were asking me, geopolitical things that have to do with this. So again, like that's one of those things where for the US, this has to be a priority, right? Like we do care about how our allies behave towards the outside world, whether they are good faith actors or not. When it comes to Hungary's relationship with Russia, its presence in the Western Balkans, ties to Serbia, Vucic, not to speak of Belt and Road, there is a massive problem that has been, that has sort of gone on without any attempts to fix it, regardless of administrations, Democratic or Republican. Even in the sort of in the Biden era, I'm not sure this has been a priority. This has that there has been a sort of clear ownership of this problem by anybody in particular in this administration, and obviously that has consequences for the cohesion of the alliance, and that's a problem that needs addressing with much greater degree of priority than it currently has been.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important that we think strategically about all these issues. So I really appreciate that the conversation. So we are coming down to the wire in terms of time, but the Summit for Democracy is here. It is happening, and so I want to do a quick lightning round. I think we'll go in reverse order of when we started. So Maria, you'll be up first, but I just want to ask, what would you like to see coming out of the summit? What are some of the, if you have one sort of wish that of what you like to see, and how you think it will play in the region, and if are there actually what we think the real potential outcomes will be in a way that could have meaningful impact. And so we'll go Maria, then Dalibor, then Peter, then Csaky. So Maria, you're up first. Lightning round.
Well, first of all, let me react to Dalibor's picture of a civil war in the European Union. It really struck me as maybe it's an anti-utopia, but I think it's also very, very worrisome. If this is the only way we can solve our European problems, we probably should act even faster. However, coming back to the Summit of Democracies, I think there are ways to actually prevent the situation of many countries following the Hungary, Poland, or other footsteps happening. And this is strengthening the democratic actors within the societies in Europe and globally. There are possibilities for democratic governments from around the world to support independent media by, for example, providing more regulations for the big tech platforms, which right now are supporting polarization financially and through the advertising models. There are ways for the democratic governments to act to bring back the international institutions back to their values, because many of these international institutions are now monopolized by autocratic governments, which, for example, threaten to defund them. There are also ways to actually create the better market situation for independent media, because these are the ones who are finally responsible for informing the citizens about pluses and minuses of certain civilizational choice, cultural choice, and value-based choice. And so my big wish for the outcome of the Summit of Democracies would be that This situation, when ethical and professional journalism is at the cornerstone of the joint democratic action to be happening and to have some very concrete agreements by the participating governments on how they create a space for a less polarized and more quality debate, where I agree there can be space for different cultural perspective and different assessments of the values.
Thank you for that. Dalbert.
But first of all, I should probably clarify how I meant my civil war remark. I'm certainly not advocating a EU-wide civil war as a solution to Europe's problems. I'm simply noting that there are structural similarities, if you will, between the EU's institutional setup and the kind of clashes between federal and state authority and sort of sources of law in the antebellum period in American history. And I'm not clear in my own mind how we get from the status quo in the EU towards something that sort of resembles a sort of workable and sustainable sort of federal order at the European level. So that's all that I was trying to say. And as long as we don't have that sort of real federal authority, I think we have to tread very carefully whenever these conflicts between different sources of law arise. When it comes to the Summit for Democracy, I think it's fair to say that the focus of US foreign policy and security sort of outlook has shifted. China has become a priority in recent years, to the point of really seeming as an obsession to some of our European friends. And I think whether we like it or not, that's how the Summit for Democracy is going to be perceived in Washington. And I think it gives Americans an opportunity at this point to in a way elevate the success stories from Central and Eastern Europe. There has been a shift in Central and Eastern Europe with regard to China as well, with Hungary being an outlier, but there is a delegation of Baltic parliamentarians in Taiwan these days. Czech Speaker of the Senate went to Taiwan last year. There is a very hawkish coalition, if you will, emerging in Prague. I think Slovakia has a government that has a fairly sort of reliable and strong geopolitical compass when it comes to these issues. So I think forging a coalition with these countries could help the United States down the road and having a better dialogue with Brussels and with sort of the EU on sort of coming up with a more coordinated transatlantic agenda when it comes to not confronting necessarily, but holding China accountable and containing some of its more malicious forms of influence around the globe. So I think there are certainly important gains from trade, if you will, between the United States and the Central Eastern European countries when it comes to really what is now the number one issue on the US strategic and foreign policy agenda these days.
Wonderful, thank you. Peter.
Yes, I just would like to first agree with Dalibor on the importance of geopolitics, and I think one clearly good development in the US foreign policy is a more clear understanding of the interplay between geopolitical influence, Russian and Chinese business, and domestic corruption, because in the broader region it really comes hand in hand, and many of the politicians who shift eastwards do it because they see direct financial benefits of it, even on their own pockets. So I think this kind of framework and understanding is way better than just looking at human rights issues and democratic issues versus geopolitics as two totally separate baskets. So I think the framework is is right, and this kind of approach. And I think this Summit of Democracies or for Democracies is a good opportunity to to strengthen some kind of commitment and to discuss mutual issues. But I have to tell, without wanting to deteriorate this celebratory mood, that there have been wounds. I mean, put on the Euro-Atlantic alliance, I would say, and after, for example, the downplay of the number of soldiers in Germany, the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, there are many question marks raised in European discussions about how strong this alliance have remained and how much the European allies of the United States can regard the US as a credible ally. So I do think there is a lot to tell and discuss, and it is very important in this time, as Dalibor said as well, to find common ground on issues such as China, for example. That I think it's a good thing that there is an emerging threat perception in the European Union about this issue. So I think there are good common denominators as topics and values to discuss, but there are a lot to discuss, and there are a lot to do to heal these wounds.
Thank you, Peter. JK, for the final word.
Thank you. I mean, I very much agree with Peter on the importance of healing those wounds, and also with Dalibor on the importance of geopolitical issues. I generally think that the summit is a good chance to strengthen democracy, and Freedom House actually has a wish list for the summit, which includes, and since this discussion will air just right before the summit, I hope that we will have some influence on that. But this includes really preserving commitments to preserve independent journalism, commitments to strengthen anti-corruption policies, and commitments to bolster protection for human rights defenders, because they are increasingly at risk of authoritarian retribution, not just in their own countries, but outside, transnationally, so even after they flee into exile. I also think that the summit is important for US foreign policy in general, and for US foreign policy to reaffirm its traditional role and focus on democracy as well, and for democracies in general to consider what they can do to prevent a democratic decline internally, so not just globally, but in their own countries. And if countries take a hard, long look at the democratic rot, why increasing numbers think that democracies are not delivering, I think that would actually be already a very meaningful outcome of the summit. I'm a little bit less sanguine about the summit's impact on the region, or at least on countries that have not been invited, and primarily that's Hungary, but also Bosnia in the region. I'm not sure what impact, if any, the summit will have on those countries.
All right. Well, I just want to thank our panel again. This was an incredible conversation. There was so much we didn't get a chance to cover. I wish we had 3 more hours with this group to talk. But I want to thank our panel again. Maria, JK, Peter, Dalibor, all of you were fantastic. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank the Embassy in Bratislava again for partnering with us on this event. And I also wanted to let our viewers know that the CEPA website, cepa.org, has plenty of resources and content, particularly around the summit. We have a new report that's out where we're partnering with the Brookings Institution and the German Marshall Fund. We have a series of essays, and of course, our website has plenty of content and resources. So please, again, it's cepa.org. And again, just want to thank our panel and for a fantastic event. Thank you all so much.